Now, I'm assuming most everyone here possesses a prized awareness of the importance of diversity in our media. But as an editor-in-chief of a publication that centers the stories of people of color, I've begun to have a problem with that word diversity, especially in our field here. Because it's come to denote a level of societal charity. That if you just sprinkle a few black and brown and native or Hispanic or LGBTQ faces, that will be enough to engender the trust of communities of color in a media that only 6% of Americans as a whole have a strong confidence in. The gospel of diversity, in practice, says that you can change nothing else about your media outlet, other than simply making an allowance for one person, or God willing, two, who come from the ranks of a marginalized of our country, and that the problems of inclusion in our media will all be fixed. However, this quick fix will never address the stubborn problem found in our media. And that is the problem of the lived experience of far too many in our society that continues to struggle to be seen and struggle to be heard and struggle to be told in an authentic way. Because their narratives are not perceived as normal, nor rational, nor relevant in newsrooms lacking in cultural sensitivity. In newsrooms whose dominant default in their judgments and viewpoints boil down too often to white male-centric. When you cover one of the most diverse zip codes in our country, as I do, you have countless stories illustrative of that everyday damage done by those default perspectives. The story I carry with me in this work is of a little girl, Mayana, whose father, Michael, was killed after an assailant burst into his apartment. When a local publication reported on Michael's death, it portrayed him on par with, if not worse than his killer. The featured contents of Michael's life focused on him being a felon instead of a father. Rather than the tragedy that befits the early death of a teacher, a basketball coach, a community organizer, a son, a brother, a husband, you were presented with a former criminal, a black male who evidently deserved an early death at the age of 33. He was, after all, convicted of a gun charge a decade ago. And so for me, that's why my community asked me to write a story about Michael, to give his life context. Because it was tired of reading yet another story presenting an incomplete portrait of another deceased black male. That's why the most profound moment of my professional career remains the day I saw Mayana. She came to me with tears in her eyes and she said, "Thank you. Thank you for telling the truth about my father when no one else would, because no one else seemed to know how." And the reason that sticks with me isn't to pat myself or my publication on the back. It has its blind spots like any other. No, the reason that sticks with me is because I hope I don't have another moment like it. I don't want another day when someone's humanity is reduced to a two-dimensional stick figure, when someone has to beg our media to be seen not as perfect, not as flawless, not as a hero, nor a villain, nor a stereotype, nor a statistic, nor a curiosity, but to be seen as human, with all of the depth and complexity and richness that title implies, whether black, white, trans, gay, lesbian, or whatever. So no, it is not only diversity that we need in our media. It is a revolution of cultural values. For consumers of news, you must continue to demand our media shines its light, illuminating and affirming the humanity of all groups in our society, whether dominant or marginal. And for us within the media, it remains imperative that we provide that light at whatever cost, because equity in our society is a bargain at whatever price paid. Mayana asked me once if journalists ever get together to talk about how to do better than what was done to her father. I told her honestly that on most days we don't. On most days it's hard enough just to work enough to put food on the table and not be bludgeoned by the cynicism that comes with this job so often. It's hard when you go home most nights to apply the scalpel of scrutiny that we possess upon ourselves and our profession. And so I'm glad that she's here tonight, so I can tell her that that's different tonight. Because tonight, we have an all-star panel of journalists of color, and it is my immense pleasure to introduce them. First, we have Venice, Buhain, She's the news editor of the Seattle Globalist and the chapter president of the Asian American Journalists Association. You can raise your hand. You have permission to show enthusiasm. You have Tyrone Beason, a writer at the Pacific Northwest Magazine and the Seattle Times. Please, sir, raise your hand. Yeah. We have Reagan Jackson. And I didn't even get to announce where she works. Anyway, she's the editor for the South Seattle Emerald and a columnist for the Seattle Globalist. We have Monica Guzman, a 2016, yes, a 2016 Neiman Fellow, and also the co-founder of the Evergrey, a new daily newsletter that is a wonderful site. I take it from me, check it out. And we also have Andrew Simon. He's the director of fellowship programs and creative projects at Grist magazine. And last but certainly not least, we have Enrique Cerna, a reporter with KCTS 9 who will be stewarding and navigating our conversation today. So Enrique, I will let you take it from here.
Thank you, Marcus. So well, good evening. Thank you all for being here. We have a good-sized audience here tonight. That's pretty good. All right, so this must mean something to you, having this topic be addressed tonight. Says, where are all the minority journalists? Well, good portion of them are here tonight, thank goodness. But let me start with this, the term diversity. Give me some feedback on when you hear that word, what it means to you in this day and time. Monica.
So what I hear in the term diversity is an aspiration that reflects a cultural value about how different we all are and how many people who are different there are that we serve in journalism. I think it can be really useful when it brings out the interest in fulfilling that ambition, in representing our communities better and telling better stories. I sometimes wish that it would just fold into a broader definition of accuracy. Because if it's about serving our communities, we don't just serve them with facts and information, we serve them with perspectives. And how can you have a good grasp on perspectives when your internal culture may not hold them and contain them and understand them?
We're sharing the mic here tonight a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, so when I hear the word diversity, it's an interesting word and it can be kind of a problematic word at the same time, because I think on the one hand, yeah, there's that definition where diversity kind of just reflects who, the definition of what we are and who we are, that we're like a society with many different people in it. But it's also, I think it's a little problematic sometimes, because I think people kind of think of it as, well, there's normality and then there's diversity. And I think that when people start to think of diversity that way, that can start to get a little problematic, kind of implying that diverse people are separate people, or diverse people, that this is a special beat. This is a special type of coverage, when it's really, we need to kind of incorporate, race and equity and that sort of thing in our everyday coverage. So.
Tyrone?
Mm-hmm.
For me, I think diversity means everything and nothing at the same time. It's a word that is very easy to grasp. It's a concept that I think we all have in our minds tonight. But when I do my work at the Seattle Times, I don't think in terms of diversity. I think in terms of what do I see when I walk down the street, when I go to an event, when I listen to someone's story. And I prefer the word experience. I think someone alluded to that. We all come with a different set of experiences and life paths, and our work here is to better understand those things and to understand how they fit into the larger picture. But diversity is easy. I used it quite a few times in a story that is in the Seattle Times this weekend on diversity and inclusion in the tech industry and the lack thereof. But there's so many levels of diversity implied by that story. It could be about race, it could be about geographic diversity, gender. A lot goes into that word, and yet I feel like there are times when it gets overused, and in its overuse it becomes diminished. And so what I try to do is I use it as a writer and put it in the story, but when I'm out in the world, I don't even think about diversity. I try to pursue my work with very open eyes and an open heart, and hope that through that I'm getting the full richness and complexity of whatever story I'm working on, and that I'm really seeing the community for everything that it is, and that's a more meaningful approach for me.
Reagan.
I would say that diversity has been overused, and I agree with Monica's assessment of it as being kind of something that we're aspiring to, kind of, and kind of not. I think more often than not, it's become kind of this, oh, let's be diverse, or let's do diverse things, but there's not enough. I feel like we're at a point where it's no longer serving us to just talk about diversity. I think it would serve us more to really speak the truth of what we're trying to accomplish and what we're trying to say.
Yeah, I think in the context of newsrooms, and storytelling, I tend to like the word representation. I like to think that publication represents the people that they speak to, and I think a newsroom should reflect the people that they speak to and the communities that they speak to. So I tend to like the word represent or representation. To diversity, because I agree with the other panelists, I feel like the term's gotten watered down over time.
Well, let me throw in what I think it means, or what it often means to me. It means numbers. And to me, it's more of like an HR term of what are the numbers in the building, what are the numbers in the newsroom. At KCTS, we recently decided to kind of examine ourselves about the issues of what's happening within our operation, and it was really brought about by the shootings that happened this summer in Baton Rouge, and also by the Dallas officers that were shot and killed. A group of us got together one day after this, and we were all a bit shaken about what's happening. And by the way, it was a mixed group of people. And through that, we started to have this conversation. We're a very small operation at KCTS, less than 90 people, and about 40 people gathered a couple of days later to have a conversation about where are we, and where are we as far as people that provide content and what we're reporting, but also how we were feeling about these things. So gradually, we developed this a committee. First, it was going to be called a diversity committee. And then there was a conversation about, is that the right term? And then we decided that no, it wasn't, that it needed to be called a race and equity committee, because those are two issues that are affecting us the most. And race, obviously, is a concern today of what's happening in our society, but equity is even more so. And so I think people grasp onto that as to how we're looking at what we do. So I think in many ways we're also still struggling with that, because we're trying to figure out, okay, how do we have an operation that is still representative of, should be anyway, of a community, but also what are we doing with our work, and is our work representative? And quite frankly, as a person of color, and I'd like the rest of you to speak about this too, I think it's important that I know what's happening in my community. I'm Latino, I pay close attention to Latino issues. Do I always report those issues? No. Have I reported those issues a lot? Yes. And I do it because I have felt for this for a long time that I need to do it. Do you guys feel that way from your communities?
So I had an interesting experience recently. So I was being screened for a certain, a radio show. And they talk about, kind of topics of the week. And it was interesting. So when I was being screened, and they asked me, well, so did your news organization cover this, right? And I was like, well, no, we didn't cover that top story. And they said, well, did you cover this top story that was in the Times? And I was like, oh, well, no, that didn't cover that one either. And it's like, well, what about this one, which was on television? I was like, no, those are all really interesting stories. So the Seattle Globalist tends to cover, we want to cover things that aren't already covered in the community. And we want to make sure that diverse voices are heard, and so we depend a lot on what people are experiencing in their communities. And so, we're not always necessarily covering the top stories, or when we are, it's sort of with that angle. And so I didn't get on the program. And at first I was like, for about 2 hours, I was like, oh man, did I mess up? I really messed that one up. And then I thought, no, we are doing exactly what we're supposed to do. We're trying to create a media environment where we can tell stories that aren't being covered already. So if we're just talking about like the same thing that all the other news stations are covering, then we are not doing our job. We're not, we're not getting those stories out there. So
you missed your chance of being on the radio show because you didn't talk about what everybody else is talking about.
I'm sure that there was another. There probably were other reasons, but I do. I kind of just thought about that might have been part of it for 2 hours. But then after that, I was like, no, we're doing exactly what we're supposed to be doing, and we should be covering things that aren't being covered. And I'm okay that they were.
How about the rest of you? Where do you feel, of the issues and things that you may have about in your community? Do you feel like that's something you need to cover, or is it, just part of the job, of the everyday thing you got to find?
For me, I was going to say, I feel in a lot of ways that that's exclusively what I cover, are South End issues or issues of people of color, because that's what's of interest to me. So that's the reason I am a journalist. And actually, to Venice's point, when I hear you talking about, oh, well, we didn't cover this or we didn't cover that, I'm thinking, no, they didn't cover all the stuff that we covered. Yeah, exactly. And that's to the core point of the problem, is why aren't they covering? Why is there such a difference between the top stories on major news outlets and what we cover?
Yeah, they should be following us.
Well, and then they do.
Guys?
I think that, as a magazine writer at the Seattle Times, I get to pick most of my stories. And I did a piece earlier this year on gentrification in the Central District. And this is a story that's been covered in one way or another. So we know the demographic realities. But for me, I also am a member of this community, meaning Seattle, and as an African American, I can see the change in this part of town. So I wrote that story out of deep concern about my own place as a black person in Seattle, and I obviously went into this community, into other neighborhoods where African Americans have migrated, to understand a bit about the reasons why and what the city is becoming in the face of this kind of change. But it was a personal story, I sat in the living room of a pastor in Madrona. I went into a church, actually several of them in Skyway, and rocked to the tambourines and did some old-time gospel shaking and clapping. But I did that because I felt like I wanted to celebrate my own blackness by celebrating the blackness that was being lost in the city. And it's funny because I didn't know that until I said that just now, why I did the story, but I did that because I feel, as journalists, our job is to go out and tell other people's stories. The fact is, we come from the world that we report on, right? So it's hard to separate yourself from the topic, especially when it comes near and dear to you. This is my experience too. And so I tried to tell other people's stories as a way to understand why it is I still live here. Why am I still a holdout? By understanding why others hold on to the Central District and why it's still a part of their heart and soul, I got a sense of what makes this city special to me, and it validated my outrage and concern about the loss of this community. Now, that's not particularly objective, But I don't think it matters in this case, because I think the story stands on its own. I think these people's experiences are valuable, and my willingness to go and sit in their living rooms in churches and other gathering places forms a relationship between the Seattle Times and its community, and between me and these folks that is itself newsworthy and interesting. And yeah, it was very personal for me. And there are times when I feel called to do a story because of who I am. You know, there's other times when it's just newsworthy. But what's great is that, in this case, it was a little bit of both, right? And this is something that the whole community should be concerned about. Whole neighborhoods are being upended by development here, and I think that it's okay right now to admit that we're concerned personally.
Others?
Yeah, so my organization has a national audience, and so I see my role, my organization, to try to reach out to more communities and get more voices from different communities across the country. You know, we predominantly cover the environment with the focus on climate change, and there's a subject area called environmental justice. A lot of you are probably aware of it. It's basically an idea that says the environmental problems and climate change does not affect all people equally, does not affect all groups of people equally. And I'm really trying to be an evangelist at our organization, and there are others too who are trying to find the voices from these communities who are adversely affected by pollution, climate change, et cetera, and hear stories for more people across the country. You know, I find that even though we're a national publication, we're in a little bit of a bubble here in Seattle, and we could do a better job of, you know, creating a greater network of voices across the country to tell these stories.
And my organization, the Evergrey, which is a new Seattle newsletter we just launched, if we have one bias, it's just that we believe that Seattle ought to be a more accessible and inclusive and exciting city for everyone. So I feel like where my background comes into that is just in acknowledging that there's all kinds of identities, all kinds of differences, and they're not always apparent, they're not always evident, but we do need to find ways to see the communities we serve the way they see themselves, not just the way some dominant culture might see them, whatever that dominant culture might be. So I take very seriously that responsibility. And I think just the ways that my difference has manifested itself in my career, you know, ways big and small, keeps reminding me, to your point about numbers, that organizations are not just people. Organizations are also systems, and they're cultures. So if what you do is change the people, you haven't finished the job. You need to make sure that those people can then change parts of the system, can change parts of the culture, can change parts of the perspectives. Because newsrooms, and we were talking earlier, are these machines that are often churning out daily things. They're not necessarily built for long games. And diversity is sort of a long game. But is it the right game? And, you know, are we building it into our daily, is it emitting a breath in our work? Or is it something that we check off a list every time this becomes a hot topic?
Well, let's talk about newsrooms and talk about how they operate and about whether the people that run them and whether there's enough representation of people of color in those newsrooms. I don't work in a daily newsroom, but I have in the past, and I would argue that no, there's not much, at least in Seattle, hasn't been much representation there, and that it has been ebbing and flowing as far as, you know, okay, we care about people of color and our numbers and diversity. I'll say diversity because it's the numbers. We care about it right now. Maybe in a year, not so much, because I think that that's kind of how it's been. So what does that then do to the quality of what's being reported or the people that are giving an opportunity to work in a newsroom? I would argue that it doesn't give them much opportunity at all. Jump in.
You're absolutely right. And the thing with diversity, as frustrating as that term is, you know,
we can't get away from it.
I know, we can't get away from it. But if your newsroom doesn't have a good mix of people, then that means that there's a really good chance that you're missing out on stories that you never even thought to conceive of in the morning meeting or in the weekly sort of Sunday meeting, or for me, I would do stories once a month. You know, I think that representation in newsrooms is really important because it's almost as if we don't know what we're missing. And I wonder what newsrooms would be like. I wonder what coverage of the Obama administration, Black Lives Matter, women's rights, LGBTQ advances would be like if more of those types of people were reporters and editors and designers and photographers and videographers and so on. What kind of media would we be if it looked completely different? And it's a frustrating question because I know that this is not going to change right away. The Seattle Times also goes up and down in terms of its representation of different kinds of people. And it can be like walking through the desert sometimes, and there's other years when it feels really good. But I think that we've got to work very hard on maintaining some consistency as people leave and as turnover and budget cuts and things take hold. We've got to make sure that this is always a priority for us. And again, I've been at the Seattle Times for 22 years. There's years when it feels like this is a major priority, and there's years when it feels like it's slipped a little bit as we try to survive as a company, And I think that for me, I don't stop bringing my diversity, even though diversity might not be at the top of the list. So it's a weird thing, right? I want to stay there and continue to do good work in the community, but I think it's incumbent upon me and some of my colleagues who are in the audience tonight to keep pushing and lifting each other up when it comes to these issues to make sure we don't drop the ball. It's very easy to when under the stresses that newspapers in particular are feeling.
Others weigh in, please.
I think it's an interesting question when it comes to hiring. I think hiring managers might have a certain, I was talking with the students about this, and they ask, it's like, well, why won't they, why is it that women, get communications degrees but they don't seem to enter into the newsrooms? And I think it's partly because there's there's a mindset of like what qualities we're looking for, and there's like some stereotypes about like who has those qualities, which schools have those qualities, which candidates have those qualities. And I guess maybe I've worked in Seattle my whole career, or like worked in Washington State my whole career, so maybe I'm a little bit naive and I'm like, I've never been, nobody's ever not called me because I'm Asian American, but I don't know the calls I didn't get, right? And I don't know who never called me back. But I think that there's, and I don't know what assignments they decided not to give me because, well, we need somebody who's kind of a forward, tall person, and that will exclude me. And so, and I think that it's a little bit of that kind of a bias as well, just sort of this presumption of who do we need in our newsroom and what kind of qualities do we need to get the type of news that we've been producing all these years. And there's not like a thought of, well, if we bring people in with different experiences and with different backgrounds, and maybe they went to different schools or didn't major in journalism, we might be able to get different angles on stories. We might get different types of stories. I think I like a media environment where all the news stations and all the newspapers have a different angle on it, and it's like, yeah, now I'm getting kind of a complete picture. Now I'm getting, different perspectives on this event, and I think that we're missing. It might be a subconscious thing or not a conscious thing when people are going out and seeking candidates for jobs.
I've just added, in addition to a storytelling incentive, let's also be pragmatic. There's a business and impact incentive as well, right? In a day and age where we measure page views and Facebook likes and know what our audience numbers are immediately, there's an opportunity to grow our audiences and to tell more stories. So the journalistic side is super important, as is the storytelling side, but there's also a practical incentive as well.
The business side is there, let's face it. There's no doubt about that. Reagan, do you want to jump in on this as well?
I do. But I want to answer kind of a different question because I feel like the question that you ask is very quantitative, and the answer I want to give is very qualitative. Because I don't know what enough looks like. in terms of when is it enough? When do we have, I don't feel like that's a numbers question. It's a question of, are we covering issues that are important to our communities? Is it resonant? Are there diverse perspectives? Are there interesting, perhaps opposing perspectives coming out of the same media outlet? Like, these are the things that I want to see in all of journalism. So I don't know how many Black people, how many Latino, I don't know, like, I don't have like a number for what the perfect ratio is or what the perfect balance is, because I don't think that's how it works. I think it works, the way that it works is that we figure out how to create structures that support everyone in the community to have as much of a voice as they possibly can. And that's when great journalism starts to happen.
Yeah, to echo that, I think Reagan's exactly right. It's that question, what does diversity look like? It seems like the wrong question. It's what does it feel like? How does it behave? And the best, evaluation of that can only come from communities themselves. So that's really who you have to ask. Not the newsroom itself, but the only test is out in the community. Is that trust coming from your community in such a way that they feel that you can speak for them, that you understand them as they understand themselves, and that you can create those conditions for all the communities you serve where they can come together and sort of blend in that way. So yeah, it's less about what it looks like or a bar you have to hit, and again, more about those systems and those cultures, and are those cultures embracing the different perspectives and the different communities you want to serve.
I want to invite folks to come up and join us. If you have a question or comment that you'd like to make, we have a microphone right here. We have someone that's going to man that. Come on up. We'd like to work you into the conversation because I think that it's very important. I ask that if you're going to make a comment, that you make it a question, that you try to make it short and sweet, and that you be nice. And if you're not nice, you're not going to be here very long. That's all there is to it. All right, go ahead, sir. You might jump in?
Yeah. I have a question about, I feel that it's possible that the Ebonics movement in the 90s had a way of lowering the bar for a skill set for journalists to come in the future, And I believe at the same time, shortly after that, maybe 15 years, as this group matured, the SAT, the standards for writing, and the GED, their requirements went up. So the defenses were for the academics were going down, while the standards for entering these fields were going up. Do you feel like that was like an ambush?
Not sure I know that. Let's see, what's the question there? Do you mean, has it changed the quality of the writing? Or
the question is, in order to be a journalist, you need to do some sort of writing. Now, 15 years prior for someone going to college, if they're being taught, don't even worry about speaking proper English, wouldn't that put a damper on writing proper English? And at the same time, the requirements were raised in the SAT on the entry level for going to school to be a journalist.
Anybody got a comment there? Go ahead.
Yeah, so we did like this kind of informal poll before we started, and I think there's only 2 of us on this panel who actually have a journalism degree. And I don't know, they don't have to reveal themselves.
No, I'll out myself. I went to I was out of a communications department at WSU. Yeah. Go Cougs, yeah.
So I would say, that journalism just doesn't have to be writing. I mean, I kind of came in thinking when I first started, and this would have been, this was actually in college, but I didn't have a journalism degree, but I kind of came in thinking, well, I'm just a really concerned citizen who wants to cover my community and and be part of a newsroom and have a lot of fun and that was kind of my whole goal all those years ago. And there are a lot of different types of journalism that you can do. And there's like photojournalism, you can be, there's a lot of podcasts out there. I don't think that being able to write, what is it, the inverted paragraph or whatever it's called, or the inverted pyramid, thank you. Yeah. The inverted pyramid is necessarily the key that unlocks the media for you. I think that it's just kind of being open and fair and wanting to be accurate and just having that dedication. And I think that there's going to be somebody who will see that in you and say, yeah, you can enter.
There's plenty of people that have made it in this business that do not have journalism backgrounds. They just are just good writers and communicators, and more power to them, I think, more than anything else.
Or photographers.
There you go, photographers or
or
podcasters and those other folks. Mm-hmm. Anything else? Tyrone, do you want to weigh in on that a little bit?
No, I wanted to offer some words of hope. I think this is a great time for language and people of color and for women and LGBTQ people. And there are a lot of good examples out there. I just was reading today in The Guardian about Paul Beatty winning the Booker Prize, an African-American novelist. And I felt this moment of pride. I mean, I think that there are plenty of people out there who are demonstrating that there's great power in the use of language and using language to really convey experience. So I'm not particularly worried about that. I think that young people are going to go into a world where there are so many models to follow, and they will create their own. I think that's what happens when generations turn over, and this is what we're kind of going through right now in our time, and people will find new ways to use language to express themselves, and you'll be really devastated in a good way by what's to come.
All right.
Yeah, I would just add that Black Twitter is kind of where it's at right now, right? I mean, there's a whole movement happening where language is being created and turned upside down, and it's being used for protest, being used for journalism. I mean, it's really exciting that this is happening, and the internet allows it to happen.
And I have to say, the greatest example of the use of language to shape thinking and to stop traffic and to get people talking, Black Lives Matter. 3 words, I think, that in and of themselves are interesting and complex, but again, there's a way that language can move us in directions that we're not ready to go, but we have to be willing to listen and sometimes stand out of the way and let that language kind of flourish. And I think that's the key for us in the news media, to the extent to which we invite people in, either through stories or literally into our newsrooms as workers, to contribute to that change and to help our own language evolve, our own framing of stories evolve.
I would argue that the arts have helped us there. I mean, you just got to look at Hamilton right now and what Lin-Manuel Miranda has done with teaching history and then helping us look at those things in a new way and bringing new people in to try to understand all of that. So, all right, I got a question here.
Hi, I'm sorry, what does mean be nice? Like George Washington or Abraham Lincoln or like a rabbit? A small question. My name is Alex Zimmerman. So I will deliver it to you 30-second message. Very simple. Hi, my daughter, F. Führer, a Nazi Ku Klux Klan degenerate psychopath. My question, very simple. I don't blame you for nothing. You guys are slave, a cheap street prostitute. It's happened in America now, like before.
Thank you very much, and if you're going to go there, then we don't want you here. So we'll move on to the next question. I believe in free speech, but you're being very rude. And this is not the time and place for it, Alex, so move on. Take the mic from him, please. Please move on. Next question. Next question. No, Alex, we're done. We're done. We're done. We're done. We've been here before. All right, goodbye. Thank you. Thank you. All right, take the mic. Thank you. Good night. Have a good night. All right. All right. I think the World Series is on. Go watch it. There we go. Thank you. Next question. Let's go.
Hi. So some of you guys, oh no.
We all right? Okay.
That was an earth-shaking.
Don't joke about earthquakes.
So some of you guys.
You know, I don't know what it is, but I always seem to draw that guy here. So who it is? There we go. Go ahead. It's me.
So you guys were talking about sometimes when times are lean, it's hard to maintain accurate representation. And I assume by lean you mean kind of unprofitable, right? And in any publication, profits are kind of always there. So I'd be curious to hear if you think that an accurate representation is sometimes at odds with profitability, or if they're actually aligned.
That's a good question and a tough one.
I think they're aligned.
Good.
Now, can I just, like, I'll take that side.
Yeah.
There you go. So I think they're aligned. I think when your news organization doesn't reflect the community and they kind of feel, and so there are certain aspects or parts of the community who don't feel like they're being represented, or you're not talking to them, you're not worried about their issues, or you're always, the media is always like representing us in a poor way, or like just not understanding us, then you kind of like lose that audience. So it's not just a matter of, we're doing this because it's good and because like we just want to be pure and we have like good intentions. It's also a matter of media survival, I think. If we want to stay relevant, we have to reflect our audience. We have to reflect the community, and the community is becoming increasingly diverse. And I think that it's vital and it's important for news organizations to just be more diverse. It's just, that's that awful word, but I'm talking about numbers. But yeah, so I think that they're absolutely aligned, and I also think that like advertisers are looking at this too. They're wanting to reach all parts of the community, anybody who is looking for their product, and so for profit and traditional news outlets, that this is something that they have to really pay attention to.
I agree.
I want to agree, and I kind of don't. I want to see that alignment. I want there to be that alignment, but what I'm seeing is that a lot of news outlets that are covering diverse issues are not seeing the same amount of funding and are not becoming sustainable in the way that they need to be. And when it's clear that the community is crying out and saying, we want this and we want to be represented, we have to look at who holds money and who they want to align with.
I think it is true that there's a little bit of a contradiction on the surface, right? But for example, African Americans, Latinos use digital media, their devices, phones and tablets, but mostly phones, to get news and information at rates that are actually higher than the general population. So there's a real opportunity there to tap into a market that we haven't already. I don't know what the formula is, but there is no lack of interest in getting news that reflects who you are and where you come from and what you're concerned about. Again, it's a question of how do we do those stories, and are we embedded in those communities enough to figure out how to tell the stories in ways that resonate and that make people want to pay $1, for that coverage. And I think that we've got to work very hard at pairing those two things up, because I don't want them to be exclusive, and they shouldn't be. There's too much of an opportunity to break into new markets for us to excuse ourselves because we don't think that people in certain communities are going to buy what we're selling. I think that maybe we should sell it differently, or have different content, or build new relationships and let people tell us what the news is in ways that we haven't before.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think that Fusion.net is a pretty good model for inclusive perspectives at scale. I mean, I believe they reach an audience of somewhere between 10 and 12 million people a month, and I mean, I think that goes along with them at least saying that their staff is 60% non-white. So I mean, I think that's a very early example of what a well-resourced operation can do, and the reach that it can have when real money is put behind diversity, equity, and inclusion.
From an organizational perspective, I'd say that it's also, while profitability and diversity and these things are aligned, I think really, the short-term sort of illusion is that they are at odds, because an organization, if an organization continues to do what they've always done, that is cheaper, that is less time, that is less money. So when we feel strapped for resources, it's harder to make the case that a hiring process should take longer, that you should do more, intentional work to make sure that you're busting out of the typical networks. And at the end, and it's human nature, people want to hang out, in the networks they already know. That's the easiest networks to tap. But if we're going to make those changes that are going to have a lasting impact, you have to break out of that. And long term, it's absolutely the most profitable direction to go.
Oh, I was going to say, I said this at the last meeting like this, but I sometimes feel like we should start calling that an innovation rather than a risk, that if we can call it a newsroom innovation, then people start getting excited about that. We're innovative. That's what we're doing. We're breaking out into new markets. That's innovative. And then and then all the muckety mucks and suits get all excited.
Yeah, then they get all, yeah.
So.
Then we like that, yeah. Yeah, go tell the sales guy. We need to get him in on that one. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. A previous question unfortunately puts this question into a interesting light. But one of the things that's kind of been talked about over this election cycle is the polarization of news sources. And as we talk about people finding sources that speak to them, people sometimes find this way of migrating into sources that only speak to them. They can, if they like Breitbart, they can get all their news from Breitbart. Or if they like The Root, they can get all of their news from The Root because that speaks to them. At what point is it, where do you draw the line between speaking to an audience and trying to understand them and pandering to an audience?
Good question. Anybody want to take that one?
I can start with something.
Let me see. Okay. Go ahead.
I can start with something that's seemingly unrelated, but I think is actually very connected. I asked this question of my fellow panelists earlier, just how many Facebook connections have been severed this election cycle, right? Because it's not just about sources of news, official sources of news, where people tend to gravitate to wherever they feel they can agree. It's each of us. So I'm actually scared of the damage being done when the channels that exist for potentially awesome conversation get shut down because it's so difficult to expose ourselves to different ideas and difficult ideas. And sometimes we just can't do it. We can't stomach it. And I don't know about you guys, but emotionally this election, some of the coverage, you just want to seek solace over here. You want to seek some risk and something kind of over there. And there is this emotional aspect to how the news works. And with this plurality of sources and plurality of people in our own networks providing these sorts of things, we are over time choosing our paths. And I'm afraid that we may be, that the other potential paths are getting overgrown and hard to walk through. And that does worry me, because then if that's the incentive, right, because it reflects human nature, again, we want to go where we feel most welcome, and if that's where the money is and that's where most of the traffic is, then how? That becomes a really, I think, critical challenge. How can we make sure that people still want to come to a space where they may encounter somebody very different from them? And how can we make sure that people do the work it takes to put themselves in that position when it's so much easier to go somewhere where there's no argument?
I think it's a challenge, for us as journalists, to keep that balance and somehow try to give those voices an equal opportunity to be heard. And I think, obviously in this presidential election year, that's been a really tough one to do. But I would hope that's the one thing that we would, keep a hold of as our ethics, that we are going to, make sure that we're going to let those voices be heard, but yet also at the same time, not take sides, but that's a tough one. It's just a real tough one at times. And, frankly, I think that I've seen a change more too in some respects of some journalists becoming more advocates on issues. I say someone like Jorge Ramos, who with Univision, who has taken up the immigration issue, strongly, And I have real mixed feelings about that. On one hand, I'm totally like, yeah, go get them, because I think that's important. On the other hand, I'm thinking, like, as a kind of an old school, old guy here, journalist, I'm thinking, I don't know that I feel that comfortable with that. But you also have to remember, too, that he's got a hell of an audience out there. And so there's kind of a business side on that type of thing as well. So, yeah. Anybody else want to weigh in here?
Thanks for that question. It's, I have two thoughts. One is that I think we in the news media, without even acknowledging it or even knowing it, pander to white people and guys every day. And it's never called pandering, it's called the news.
There's a Twitter quote for you. There you go.
And it's not that it's not news, it's just that there's more news. And so it's not necessarily pandering to bring a voice into the coverage that wasn't there before, and to do it in a way that feels a little more sentimental or sympathetic. I don't particularly edit that out of my conversations with people in the community. I covered the Trump rally in Linden this spring, and I skipped across the street, talking to supporters as well as a lot of the Bernie Sanders supporters at the time who were yelling and screaming at the Trump supporters, just to get a sense of how the public's discontent was sort of driving our politics. And I met a woman there who was Muslim American who told me that she stopped wearing her headscarf because she didn't want to be questioned and doubted in the community that she lived in up in Bellingham. And I decided to put that in the story the moment she started to cry about the experience of sacrificing a part of herself in order to be a part of our world and her world. She's a citizen, she has every right to dress however she wants, but felt like she needed to do something in order to keep from looking suspect. And I did that out of deep concern for her, but also because I feel like that's the kind of story that everyone else needs to hear. We have different pathways to our experience as Americans. It's not always easy, but I think what we discount quite often is the level to which we pander to the people who represent the majority or who represent our sort of recognizable market at any given time. And it's people like her who have to stand on the side of the street and cry to a reporter who have to kind of beg to be in that conversation. So at that point, I don't care if it's pandering or not. I think it's something that we all ought to incorporate into our thinking about politics and the way our society is organized. And also, it's just an interesting story, what it is to be an American in 2016. And so I don't really worry about that question so much. I think moments like that are compelling enough and worthy enough to put in. And if people think it's pandering, that's fine, but I would say read the rest of the paper and you tell me which is which.
Yeah.
And that goes for all media. And that's not just for the Seattle Times. I mean, I think that's generally the case with the mainstream media in this country. And so I don't want to sound like I'm picking on my own employer, although we have responsibilities in this regard as well, right? But that's what I'm hoping that I'm doing and a lot of my colleagues are doing. But basically go to any city in the country and watch TV, listen to the radio, or read the paper. And again, you tell me what's pandering.
I like you picking on your employer. That's good. Yeah. Anybody else want to weigh in on this? Okay, let's move on. Go ahead.
Briefly,
Reagan.
I don't want to cover what's been covered because I feel like you said it perfectly. But I will say I just recently wrote an article called White Bias in Media is Ruining Your Life, whether you know it or not, and I recommend that you read it. It's a suggestion. But also I think in general, like, kind of what you're getting at is the idea of there's still this misconception that somehow journalists are unbiased or that we're actually legitimately able to claim some type of objectivity. And me personally as a journalist, I don't believe in that, and I would rather just tell you the ways in which I'm biased so you can make up your own mind.
Before we go on here, I want to admit to one bias. I mentioned it, I think, to everybody earlier. I co-moderated a gubernatorial debate last week, and so we, C.R. Douglas and I were co-moderators, and so we were writing questions for this. And the night before, we spent like 3.5 hours in a bar trying to go into all of these questions about what we were going to ask. Got long. Anyway, but one of the questions that I had several questions that we're dealing with Eastern Washington, but also we're dealing with issues that I thought were statewide, but also national, and one of them had to do with the shooting of Antonio Zambrano Montes, and also this issue of whether malice is something that it's being questioned now, and whether a law should be changed about that. We had a discussion where one of the other people was wondering, is that one we should lead with in that conversation, or the questions that night? And we went back and forth over that because this one individual, I mean, he brought up a good point. He just thought that we should have a broader question. And I argued that I thought it was a broader question, that I thought it also was an important local question, and that we had to remember where we were and what, and my point was that I kind of grew up in that area, and I said, you have to remember that you have a large Latino population in a place like Pasco, which is 55%, So that was something that I brought to the table that nobody else knew there. Well, I didn't know that. I didn't know that it was 55% here. And I said, well, it is. So I think you have to keep those things in mind. So I'd like to think that, that knowledge and having grown up there brought something to the table in this conversation. And it's a gubernatorial thing. So I think if there's a bias, it was that I was arguing for that question, but I just think that we bring those things to the table. And they're very important. We should bring that to a newsroom. We should bring that to an argument with our general managers or whomever, and so that they understand. And I think that that's our responsibility that we have. I'm in a more traditional setting. I'm not at a small operation, but I think we do have that responsibility to speak up. So.
And I'd like to add, actually, in regard to Pasco and that case, my editors were good enough to allow me to travel to Pasco with a colleague of mine, photographer Erica Schultz, to write about the aftermath of that shooting and how the community, in a way, responded and called for change in ways that they hadn't before. And so I interviewed a lot of folks in Pasco, in the Latino community, about what that shooting meant to them, but also what it meant to live in the Tri-Cities. And I came away really enriched by that experience and speaking across language barriers with my really awful Spanish, and people were so gracious to me. And you talk about bringing things to the table as a person, but sometimes as reporters we have to set a table and allow people to come to it and talk to us in really honest and open terms. I don't come from the community of Pasco, and I'm not Latino, but I let my curiosity sort of guide me there and just create a space where people could share those stories about what it was like to live in a place that is majority Latino, but where economic and political power are concentrated among whites, and how that in and of itself kind of plays out in the aftermath of a police-involved shooting. And so it was great to go there and sit at other people's tables, but I felt like as a reporter with my notebook and the photographer with her camera, we were creating another table that the Seattle Times could lay claim to and share with folks on this side of the mountains about a really important story that's really being told in communities all over the country in terms of police shootings.
Yeah, unfortunately in that respect, yeah. Go ahead.
Hi. I want to ask a quick question and then make a comment and then ask another question. Try to tell you
okay,
what
we're going to 9 o'clock, okay?
No.
Here we go.
Monica, didn't you used to work for the Times?
Yes, I did a Sunday column there for a couple years.
Okay, I thought I remember seeing your name. Okay. So, but the gentleman in the blue shirt who works for the Times, what is your name again?
Tyrone.
I'm sorry?
Tyrone.
Tyrone?
Beason.
Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. Your picture isn't in the paper, so I never knew. Okay.
Go incognito.
You've been there for 20 years. Okay. I had the opportunity to sit in at one of those I think it was a Monday morning meetings at the Seattle Times about a year ago because I went to school with Jack Broom and he invited me. But I didn't see you and I didn't see you. Okay, so I guess, Monica, it kind of goes to what you were saying about the media ought to speak to the people that are reading it and listening to it. I think the media is very biased, right? Media is very biased. I don't know, it slaps me in the face every time I look at the Times or every time I look at the news on TV. I mean, here, I just brought some examples, but somebody recently told me, because I was telling them, I said, well, every time it's a person of color, especially a black person, that does something that's criminal, they will identify them right away. They will have their picture on the front page of the paper, and they will have it on the front page of the paper over and over again. But if it's a white person, they won't say, this man was white. They won't have his picture on the front page of the paper. It'll be somewhere in a farther page. For instance, here, a 40-year-old Seattle man was charged Thursday with 3 counts of second-degree rape. It goes on and never says the color. I mean, if it was a black man, they would say the man described as black. It never says color, so I know it's a white man, right? Okay.
So do you have a question? I'm sorry, I know you're kind of getting to your point.
Oh,
but.
okay. Wondering in the mainstream media, do they ever throw out at the meetings questions to, I mean, very few people of color at the meetings, but does this sound right? You know, do they ever, I was reading this article about the Native Americans, and I mean, did they go to any Native Americans and ask them if this was accurate? Do you know this one? It was last weekend, I think.
Is this in the North Dakota issue, or what?
Excuse me?
North Dakota issue, is that the, never mind, I'm sorry.
No,
yeah.
It's a whole insert about Washington tribes.
Okay.
But then they have some things on the back that are just not accurate.
So, okay.
I'm just wondering, when you see things like that, you see bias, do you ever speak up, tell the other reporters?
I think, at the Seattle Times, we've done a lot of talking this year about representation, about accurately covering different communities and the different safeguards that we can put in place to prevent incorrect biases from filtering, helping steer stories. And I think it's a really difficult conversation for us to have. One thing that we've done at the Times is to have kind of a monthly or bi-weekly meeting where we just sit in the room and we talk about what we see in the Seattle Times, our vision for the future, things we want to change. It's helping to break the ice, I think, and we need to do that. We need to trust each other as colleagues, reporters, editors, and so on, to have these discussions before publication rather than after a complaint is filed or what have you. I think it's a challenge for a lot of newspapers, but we're, in our own way, we're at least opening up new lines for dialogue and our own sort of watchdogging in the newsroom. And I hope to come back to you next year and say that there's been significant change, but I think we'll need to do more coverage and do more things and hear from folks like you about that. But
it's just so much bias. I mean, newspapers are used in the classrooms, for instance, and for the teacher to hold up the paper and show it's always a black criminal face, but the white criminals aren't shown. So I mean that.
I don't want to.
Wait. What the other two? Thank you.
So just a quick programming note. We have about 10 minutes, so I'm not sure if we're going to get through everybody in line, but a reminder that if you're interested in talking more, particularly at a grassroots level or meeting with some folks in affinity groups, our artists in residence, Min, will be hosting a little talk back in our cafe right afterwards for the sort of more burning questions. But we have about 10 more minutes for Q&A.
I'm trying. Go ahead.
My name is Guy. I'm with Real Change. Well, thanks all for being here tonight, so thank you. I have a question that kind of stems from an assumption that us as POC people have maybe in your own spheres or prior experience have seen examples or crimes of cultural appropriation in journalism. And I wanted to kind of like see like an example of that, and then also maybe like whoever says an example of that can answer the question of what are some ways we can prevent that, and oftentimes just committed in the process, or people trying to shoot towards diversity, right? But kind of absently, mentally fail and culturally appropriate.
Anybody want to take that? I think that you stumped us.
I don't know that I have an example for you, but I mean, I'll point back to a point that I think Monica was making earlier. I mean, I think for newsrooms to get better, these issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, they need to be baked in to the culture of the organization, and they need to be put into the thought processes, the hearts and minds, if you will, across the staff. So when editorial decisions are made, it doesn't have to be the person in the color or the couple people of color on staff don't have to be in the room when editorial decisions are made. So I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, I think that's on the solution side of it, but again, just going back to what Monica said, I think it is really important. I mean, I think workplace cultures really have to change. You need buy-in from leadership, everyone in an organization, to raise awareness about some of the issues we're talking about.
I just think it's like a fine line sometimes between cultural appropriation and diversity. I don't know, but yeah.
Thank you. I'll take another question here, and then I want to ask a question before we wrap up. Go ahead.
Hello. Oh, okay. Hi, so I'm a writer for the Daily of the University of Washington, and I'm from the Indian community, and I often find that there's a general lack of Indians in journalism, and Indian voices, both at my newspaper and outside. When I try to sort of redress it somehow, I usually go to my Indian American or Indians from India, you know, the friends from there, and I ask them whether or not they'd like to write. And usually what I get is some sort of platitude about needing to write, but they don't end up writing or expressing themselves. So while we have spoken about the need for organizations to reach out to people of color, I think there's also a need for a feedback loop where we as journalists of color go back to our communities and inspire these people to write more. So a virtuous cycle is set up. So I was wondering, A, if the panel agrees with that, and B, if we should do that, then how should we approach it?
That's a good question.
I want to throw some kudos to the Seattle Globalist because they do all kinds of wonderful workshops and training for people in Seattle, including many people of color. And I think that's the way to go, because as we know, journalism is not reserved for the people who hold some title or position in an organization, right? Anyone can commit an act of journalism when they, with the intention of being responsible, share information with others. And so part of all of us trying to come to a place where we can better understand each other includes the very necessary step of people with different perspectives having confidence that they can express themselves well to the public at large. That's a set of skills. It's also a confidence. And to the extent that journalists can help their communities, their networks, you know, journalists of color can help do that, that's great. I mean, that'll be wonderful, right? Because the stories don't just come from news sources. They should circulate throughout our entire city. So yeah, I love that.
I got a question here that was tweeted to me. So why is journalism still so white?
Another hour and a half.
We're coming back tomorrow night. No, weigh in quickly. Somebody. Is it just because managements still don't see a need to diversify? And there's that word again. Or what? Or we just go through these cycles where, okay, we're going to do it this week. We're going to have somebody. And
I mean, there's like a whole bunch of different answers, but access, either access, money, resources,
commitment.
Commitment. Actually, the media itself, in the ways in which, like, for me, I never even thought of being a journalist because I never saw any journalists that really reflected my values or that did what I would want to do as a journalist. So it was just kind of by accident that I kind of stumbled into this profession where I was like, oh, I can actually do these things or tell the stories about people of color. So I'm thinking if you're growing up nowadays and you're not seeing yourself reflected, if you're not seeing what you want to be, why be a journalist?
I'd like to add that, journalism is so white because I think, in a way, the country is still so white in terms of who holds power, who makes decisions about who gets hired and fired, who's been taken out to lunch, as I put in my diversity and tech story this weekend, who has access to those pathways for inclusion and leadership. And as the country changes and learns good lessons along those lines, I think newspapers will. I'd like for newspapers to, speaking of my own profession here, to be a leader in that, right? But I think that it's reflective of the broader kind of breakdown of power in the country, and who has access, who doesn't, who has power and who doesn't. And newsrooms are so white. I mean, if you were actually to look at most newsrooms and even metropolitan areas that are overwhelmingly Black and Latino, they're overwhelmingly white. So we're not kidding here, folks. And so we need, if there are people within earshot of me who are of color, who are women, who are gay, lesbian, trans, who are poor, who are from Eastern Washington, whatever you happen to be, whatever you can bring to the table, start writing and find us, because we need to make sure that the folks who do the hiring and recruiting know that there's a whole world out there that's being missed. So please help us be ambassadors for this good cause. As the country changes, it'll be almost criminal not to have more people like ourselves represented in newsrooms from the top on down. But I fear that's sort of where we're stuck right now. And the Times is doing what it can. I know other organizations are as well, but it's a crisis. We're going to leave the past 8 years with the first Black president, and yet I feel like even that watershed moment didn't lead us to a place where there are more people writing about him as president who are like him. And I think that we've got to address that moving forward as different types of people ascend in the country. It'll look really ugly if newsrooms remain the way they are today.
I just want to say quickly that the reason I became a journalist is because I didn't see people like me. And I still feel like that today. And so I think we have a responsibility to encourage our communities to get involved, So it's on us too. Go ahead, quickly.
I just wanted to say to the panelists that discussed the diversity of ideas, it brought to mind the incident in Cedro Woolley, where there was a news organization that reported that they had banned police officers, and then there was another journalist who actually spoke the language and took the time to get to know the other side of the story. And so I think those are things that are forgotten, these experiences that we bring forth. But my question was actually that how can we protect First Amendment rights in these times when, publishing an article can be so divisive politically, but also when we have citizen journalists that are trying to document officer-involved incidents, and we're seeing them kind of being pushed away from that, and we're seeing reporters who are pushing the immigration issue being escorted out of rooms. So how can we protect the First Amendment for citizen journalists, but also for journalists of color working at news organizations?
That's a good question. That's a tough one.
That has to be the last question, so if there's any closing remarks folks have as well.
Well, go ahead.
I think we all agree with you that the First Amendment is, really a very important amendment, and and yes, that's why it's first. And and no, I very much agree with you that that's got to be something that we're kind of keeping in mind and keeping in the forefront. I guess how do we do that? I guess if we we have to keep reminding people that this is a right that we have, and that this is a right that everybody has to be a journalist.
I also want to say that I've seen some citizen journalism that has made some difference, and it's brought up some questions that has caught the eye of mainstream journalism, news operations in this town, suddenly made them take a look at a community in the international district and elsewhere, so that can be very positive and hopeful. Any closing remarks, folks, you want to make here? Don't leave me hanging. What? Okay.
Hi, my name is Aaliyah, and I write for the Globalist and the Examiner. I just want to point out that this is what happens when white guys take up so much space in the beginning. We don't have time for POC and women to ask their questions. So just want to let you know, this event is called the Journalism So White, so you better sit down for once and for a long time, because we here, and I'm standing, and I'm shaking so much because there's a lot of things going on in my head. Also, if you want to hire me to write, I'm available.
All right. That was good. That was very good. She's going to make journalism not so white. Here we go. Hey, you know what? We're out of time. You know, I tried to do what I could to, you know, move the guy along. But thank you so much for being here this evening. This is, you know, this is an important conversation. It's a complicated one. It's a tough one. But, you know, thanks to my fellow panelists for being here, and Marcus and Town Hall for doing this, you know. And I guess we're just going to have to come back and have another conversation and see if she got a job. Thank you. Good night.